All right. Thanks for being here over the lunch hour today, everybody, to talk about non-target herbicide injury in the urban environment. So, like Carrie said, I work at the Schutter Diagnostic Lab in Bozeman, Montana, and we're a plant clinic. We help people with all kinds of plant questions that they have. Most of the questions that come in are "What's wrong with my plant?" kind of questions. And we have entomologists that work in there. We have pathologists, and then we have a lot of questions about plants that are showing symptoms of, something else in their environment. And I bring expertise in diagnosing herbicide symptoms into the mix. So herbicides have pros and cons, don't they? Just like any weed management tool that we use. We can think of the pros easily. They're really effective when we use them correctly. They're efficient. They kill the weeds when we do it right. But one of the things that we need to look out for is non-target herbicide injury. So when I say non-target herbicide injury, I just mean the herbicide is impacting a different plant in the environment than we were trying to kill. So a plant that we want, right? So that's what I mean by that. Herbicides by and large can't tell when something's a weed. So we are in charge of making sure that we keep the plants that we want safe. If that's what we're trying to do. All right. So today I've got a few objectives I'd like to get through with the group. We're going to learn some about herbicides. I mean, we're getting some continuing education credits here. We better, learn about herbicides a little bit. We're going to learn about common causes of non-target herbicide injury to plants that we see in the diagnostic lab up here in Montana. In the residential kind of environment. And I'm going to introduce a little bit about some lookalike plant health issues, just because, that's also important to keep in mind. You can't always blame everything on herbicides, that's for sure. So in order to accomplish these objectives, here's what we'll talk about. I'll talk about how I diagnose herbicide symptoms at the lab. We'll go over a little bit how to recognize herbicide symptoms in plants. And that is going to involve a little bit of discussion of herbicide mode of action. But again, we're getting pesticide credits, so, we got to talk about them. All right. I'll go through 3 herbicide symptom case studies from the Schutter Lab that kind of illustrate some of the things we see in the lab. And we'll talk about how they could have been prevented. So, spoiler alert, a lot of the time, the answer is going to be read the label. So, spoiler alert. And then we'll look at some examples of when herbicides are not the issue. And then we'll be done. All right, let's get started. So the kind of herbicide diagnosis that I do at the Schutter Lab is visual, okay? So I look at the plant, look at the symptoms, talk to the client, see what might be going on. We, my other colleagues at the lab look at it too to make sure it's not an insect or disease problem, okay? So it's kind of it's a visual kind of an assessment. We don't do any residue testing of plant tissue in our samples. We don't have that available at our lab. So the way that we do this is first we look at the plant symptoms and describe them, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I have the client tell me if they can tell me about any patterns in the area where the plants are, to see if other plants are affected, if there's some kind of obvious pattern going on. Is the injury all next to the driveway? Is it in spots in the yard? Stuff like that. We rule out disease, insect, and other environmental or abiotic problems. Okay, when I say abiotic, I just mean non-living factor in the environment. Okay, so weather, things like that, nutrient problems. We try to determine a detailed site history if we can get that information from the client. And this can include herbicides used in the last couple years even, especially in like a crop situation. And then other site information that might be important. And then if we know what herbicide was applied, I really just go right to that label and look at the label and see what warnings are on there about what to look out for non-target injury. And a lot of times my answer is right there. Labels are really, really useful tools for me at my job. And then finally, I look at the symptoms and see if they match the herbicide mode of action that was applied, if we know that. And I'll show you examples of that today. So this analysis tells us that the symptoms are consistent with the given herbicide, and I can suspect that a herbicide might be involved, but I don't always get the our clients don't always follow through and get the residue testing from a different lab. So sometimes we're not 100% certain that happened. So as I go through talking today, you might hear me use that kind of language, that the symptoms are consistent. And that's because that's the kind of assessment that I do. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about recognizing herbicide symptoms in plants. So to start this conversation, we'll talk about just assessing plant symptoms in general, okay? So a really important thing to keep in mind is we should be comparing the symptomatic plant to a healthy or normal plant. What should the plant look like? And here's an example of what I mean. This is a sample that we got in the lab. It's a lilac. And if I didn't know what a lilac looked like, maybe I'd think it looked normal. But here's a healthy lilac. And so compared to that, you can see that there's kind of more leaves coming out of the stem in each node than you would expect. It looks kind of witch's broomy. The leaves are narrower, maybe they're a little yellower. So it's important to know what the plant's supposed to look like. And this seems obvious, but sometimes it can get tricky if you have like a weeping cultivar of a tree or something like that. So this can be an important step. Another important thing to keep in mind is where in the plant symptoms are showing up. So if we've got a bean plant here, right? And in an annual plant like this bean plant, you might see the new growth at the top of the plant, as well as the axillary growth or the side shoots coming out between the stem and the leaves. Those can both be places where new growth occurs. And older growth in this case would be further down the canopy. So these lower leaves would be the older leaves. And this is important for herbicide symptoms because some herbicides impact the plant at the new growth first, and some herbicides impact the plant at the old growth first. And some do both, but this could be a really important clue to what you're looking at. All right. And of course, I bet a lot of us have sprayed 2,4-D or something. We know what distortion symptoms look like, but we might throw this word around a little bit today, epinasty. And that just means curling or twisting kind of distortion. So sometimes we have herbicide symptoms that look like curling or twisting. Another kind of distortion we see is leaf cupping. So you can see that in this elm tree here. It has the edges of its leaves are kind of rolling up. It might feel thicker than normal. That is showing leaf cupping type distortion, and some crinkling too happening in there. And then an important symptom is discoloration. Okay, so herbicides can cause a lot of, cause plants to turn different colors depending what they're doing to them. One word we might throw around is chlorosis. Could be white or yellow coloration of the plant. So we've got our normal pea over here, and then our symptomatic pea has yellow chlorosis. And for extra credit, if we were sitting in front of each other, I would say, is this on the new growth or the old growth, this chlorosis? And of course, everyone would chime in and say, the new growth, Noelle, it's on the new growth. So these peas are showing yellow chlorosis and the new growth at the top. And then we might also hear the word necrosis, which is browning or dying tissue. So that can be a symptom as well. So another concept for looking at herbicide symptoms is that herbicides within a mode of action tend to cause similar plant symptoms. This is very convenient for me. There are many fewer modes of action than there are herbicide active ingredients in the world. So I don't have to remember a million different types of symptoms, luckily. So here is a little graphic showing 3 different samples from the lab showing symptoms of 3 different herbicide modes of action. You can tell they all look very different. Our pine tree is showing symptoms of distortion. Our lentils are showing symptoms of discoloration and stunting. And then our corn plant here has some necrotics or brown spots. So what is mode of action, in case we haven't taken our pesticide applicator test lately? So we remember that herbicides have to travel through the plant and reach a site of action in that plant to disrupt a life-supporting process or structure, right? They're going in there to affect a specific system in the plant. So mode of action, when you hear me say that, it just means how an herbicide works, meaning the specific system in the plant that is affected by an herbicide. And these are broad. This is the broader category. Currently, I think of there being about 8 herbicide modes of action, and examples of the types of systems they disrupt are, there can be photosynthesis inhibitors, there can be growth regulators, there can be cell membrane disruptors, that kind of stuff. Big picture, kind of broad categories of herbicides. And when we're thinking about mode of action, what part of the herbicide product are we talking about? So herbicides are made up of active ingredients, right? That's the chemical that actually affects the plant. And they also have inert ingredients, which help the herbicide molecules get them where they need to go. So when we're talking about mode of action, we're talking about the active ingredient of that herbicide. So in this case, the active ingredient is glyphosate. So we would be thinking about that is the part of the herbicide that we're thinking about when we're talking about mode of action. So if a herbicide has more than one active ingredient in it, it could have more than one mode of action. If a product does. So just want to make sure that is clear. All right. So mode of action groups for today, we're only going to talk about 3. I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you about 8 of them in 1 hour. We're going to talk about 3 that I see affecting plants in the urban environment sometimes. And these are going to be, first, our amino acid synthesis inhibitors. An example of this that we might see in an urban environment is glyphosate. We're going to talk about our synthetic auxins, also sometimes called growth regulator herbicides. And examples of these are 2,4-D, dicamba, aminopyrrolid, picloram, so milestone and tordon. And then we're going to talk about photosynthesis inhibitor herbicides. And these we don't use quite as much. Maybe in the urban environment, we're using them mostly as like a bare ground kind of a product. All right. So let's get into these. So amino acid synthesis inhibitors, I guess I'm also going to say, if you really, I'm going to talk about each of these modes of action, and I'm going to show you examples of each of them from the lab. And if you want to, take notes and think about what mode of action might be causing things, feel free. All right. So amino acid synthesis inhibitor herbicides, each act on specific enzymes in the plant to prevent production of specific amino acids. Okay, so there's a few different types of these, but this is the general idea. And amino acids are needed for making proteins and other products, and they're needed for the plant to grow and survive. After these herbicides are applied, plants stop growing and they kind of slowly die. It's kind of like they're starving to death almost. And examples of these, again, in the urban environment, glyphosate, but also things like or SU or group 2 herbicides in other settings. So what do the symptoms look like? Here's a strawberry plant showing symptoms from this group of herbicides. It's showing really nice chlorosis on new growth. So that's that super yellow chlorosis there on the top of the plant, the newest leaves. Sometimes we see stunting and distortion as injury progresses. And like I said, growth stops pretty much after we apply these, and then the plant tends to die pretty slow in general. Here's what the symptoms look like on a monocot. Maybe this is like a sorghum or something like that. So again, that yellow top on the grassy plant. So some of these are non-selective, like glyphosate, and will affect broadleaf and monocots, or broadleaf and grassy plants. And I also want to show you what symptoms of this group of herbicides look like on woody plants, okay? Because we see this sometimes. And we'll talk about this in more detail later. But so this is a sample we got in the diagnostic lab. This is a rose. You can barely tell. It has symptoms of dying back from the tips of the branches. So the symptoms are the worst at the newest growth. Has excessive sprouting, so more leaves than you would expect coming out of each node. And then the leaves are narrow and kind of yellow, okay? And this is a rose bush that's kind of trying to grow out of a glyphosate application from last year that it accidentally got a whiff of. All right. So let's move on to our next mode of action, which is our growth regulators, or our synthetic auxins. Here, the plant process affected is just, hormone balance is disrupted within the plant and growth abnormalities occur. Okay, I'll show you examples. We've seen this as pesticide applicators out there. There's a lot of different herbicides in this group, depending on which one you're using. They might be applied to the soil or the leaves. They move to the growing points of the plant in the vascular tissue. So that means we're going to see the symptoms on the new growth first. Generally, these are selective for broadleaves if we use them according to the label. And examples are 2,4-D, dicamba, aminopyrrolate or milestone, and picloram or tordon. So symptoms of these guys, we might see, if we feel the leaves like this maple tree, they might feel leathery and thick. That aspen tree next to the Sharpie is showing a little bit of leaf cupping and just kind of weird distortion at the tips. That's pretty classic. We've got some serious twisting happening there with the 2,4-D plant. I think that's an asparagus, which is kind of weird. And then we have this broccoli family plant here, this cabbage family plant, showing symptoms of stem callus formation, which happens kind of at a sublethal or a lower dose that takes a while to get the plant to die. So that's kind of interesting. Symptom we don't see all the time. All right, so just a lot of distortion with these guys. And then my last group of herbicides I'll talk about today is photosynthesis inhibitors. And this is a group of herbicides that inhibit specific parts of photosynthesis. There's a couple different groups. Today, we're going to talk about herbicides that affect photosystem 2. So there's a couple ways that herbicides in this group affect plants. They're messing up photosynthesis, so they're messing up the way that plants get energy. But also they are impacting the way that plants accept electrons from the sun. So they're like excited in the plant and can go around causing free radicals and damaging cell membranes and just causing all kinds of havoc because those electrons aren't calmed down like they normally are during photosynthesis. So secondary destructive compounds are produced. It's more than just starving to death. There's a lot of damage going on in the plant from these as well. So symptoms of this specific group of herbicides, a lot of yellowing and browning. For these, it'll start on leaf edges or between veins or on the tips of the needles. Often the chlorosis is very yellow or very white. So we can see that in these pictures here. Our broadleaf plant has that really yellow chlorosis starting at the edges of the leaves that's progressing. Eventually those will turn brown around the edge. And here's our pine tree. It's showing symptoms that have progressed a little further. So it started out yellow at the tips of the needles, and then those turned brown and the yellowing progressed inward. So that's kind of classic symptoms from this group. Site history is key. You might imagine there's a few different things that can cause these kind of symptoms, like nutrient deficiency or something like that. So was an herbicide applied that can cause these kind of symptoms is important to ask. All right. So with that, let's get on to talking about some case studies for some of these herbicides. So I'm going to illustrate kind of 3 different kind of categories of injury that we see in the lab. We see drift for sure. So, we apply the herbicide and it moves off site due to, wind or volatilization, something like that, right? So the herbicide goes away from where we applied it somehow. Some of these cases we see, we've accidentally actually applied the herbicide to the plant that we don't want to hurt. And we're going to talk about ways to avoid that in our case studies. And then we also see carryover in vegetable gardens, especially in products like topsoil, compost, and manure. So we'll see some of that too. All right, so case number 1 is the case of the sad lilac, okay? This is sad situation for this lilac, as you can see in this picture. Here's a picture that I got from a client. The lilac is showing symptoms that are pretty substantial. When the client sent me a more close-up shot, we could see the plant was almost trying to resprout from these little sad little growths on the branch there. And then here's a sample that they sent me. Okay, so there's a healthy lilac, right? We remember this. It's not what this looks like, is it? So the question is, are these symptoms consistent with the mode of action that we talked about today? Maybe think about it for a second. Have we seen this today? I would argue that we have, or else I wouldn't be showing it to you. But yes, we have seen these symptoms today. So what happened in this case? A homeowner used an herbicide to control weeds at the base of their lilacs in a flower bed. Okay. And it was this herbicide that they shared with me, or good old herbicide product number one, just a real good one. But it has the active ingredient in this herbicide is glyphosate. Okay. So do the symptoms match the mode of action applied? Well, glyphosate is an amino acid synthesis inhibitor. And yes, the symptoms are consistent with glyphosate injury. We saw the dieback from the branch tips. We saw the excessive sprouting from the nodes, things like that. Say yes, the symptoms are consistent. So I just want to point this one out. We see this a few times a year. Glyphosate is often used in landscaping settings, and it's labeled for that use, right? In your, rock bed or something like that. But I just want to caution you to be cautious with this use, using glyphosate in your woody plants, because they can be sensitive. I think a lot of times we think it's just going to totally be safe because we don't think about glyphosate having a lot of soil activity. So we don't think about it being taken up by the roots of plants. But if the herbicide drifts onto a nearby susceptible woody plant, or we accidentally apply it to suckering growth of the plant that we don't recognize as such, or we accidentally get it on thin young bark or exposed roots, it can be actually absorbed into the plant. So just be careful with glyphosate, even near like the trunk of a woody plant that maybe you wouldn't necessarily think of as being susceptible, though this is absolutely a labeled use in a lot of settings. All right. Case number 2, the case of the croaking conifers. This is a sample, or the photo that I got from one of my clients, and that tree is not happy, is it? I would say it's dead. But luckily they had some trees. So they had a whole driveway where all the trees were looking some level of sad. And luckily they had a few that had some needles still on them. So we've got a spruce and a pine here showing symptoms of yellowing, that is progressing to browning towards the inside of the needle. Yeah. So are these symptoms consistent with any mode of action we discussed today? They are. Certainly. Let's see what might have happened. So the client in this case was also kind enough to share the herbicide that they applied near the trees with me, which is very helpful. So the homeowner used an herbicide to control weeds in their gravel driveway that these conifer trees were lining. Okay. And the active ingredient in this herbicide, there was 2, bromacil and diuron. And both of these are photosynthesis inhibitors with that photosystem 2 kind of site of action. So yes, I would say the symptoms are consistent with the herbicide applied. Okay. So the question we get this a couple times a year, a few times a year, can be really costly damage. People lose trees over this, right? And the question is always, but I didn't apply, the herbicide to my tree. How could this have happened? Okay. And it's because, so we have some warnings on the label here that can help us kind of figure it out. It's not spelled out super clearly in this case, but certainly this herbicide is not labeled for use in residential areas. This is kind of this particular product is more of like an industrial kind of a area that it's labeled for. It says don't use in any areas around homes, I think, and has some warnings about preventing loss of trees specifically. And it warns a little bit about not draining or cleaning equipment near desirable trees or other plants or onto areas where roots of the trees extend, which is a clue for us in this case. And it says do not use on, walks or driveways, etc. So what happens in these cases is, these are bare ground herbicides in a lot of cases. There, it's really nice to be able to apply a herbicide to your gravel driveway and not have any weeds come up, right? But the hard thing is if there's trees lining the gravel driveway or the, RV pad or something like that, and the tree roots are extending under that gravel surface, they can take up these herbicides that are really quite damaging to trees. So this is something to look out for sure. Okay, and one more. I've got one more. Mystery in the greenhouse. Dun, dun, dun. So here's a picture that I got from a client of their newly installed greenhouse out south of Bozeman. What is happening. You can see in this picture, maybe things look a little different than you would expect from our tomato plant there, especially in the newer growth at the top of the plant. I asked for closer up pictures and they sent me pictures of this bean and this tomato. Okay. And what I see here, I see the tomato is showing pretty good distortion symptoms. It's got some curling and cupping and epinasty on those upper leaves. And then this bean isn't quite as pronounced, but it's got a little bit of leaf cupping and crinkling going on. So are these symptoms consistent with the mode of action we discussed today? I think that they are. I'll let you think about that for a second. Which one of the three might it be? I'll tell you the answer in a second. Don't worry. Okay. So this case is what I hear a lot from gardeners that have this issue in their garden, and it is, we don't spray herbicides. Okay. So this takes a little more detective work for me. Because, we look at that sample. I always, have our insect and disease folks look at it. They're like, it's not insect or disease. So we're like, what's happening? So this case, they used composted manure from a neighbor as fertilizer or as like a soil amendment as they were installing their new greenhouse. Like I said, no insects or diseases were present that we thought would cause the issue. Instead, I suspected synthetic auxin or growth regulator herbicide carryover in the manure. And, if they wanted to find out for sure, they could get further testing for that herbicide residue done. And this is tricky, okay? Because if this is an herbicide issue, the herbicide application happened like farther up the chain. It wasn't this landowner, so we don't really know exactly what happened, okay? But we do know that sometimes people apply growth regulator synthetic auxin herbicides in pastures where grazing animals are grazing that can carry over in manure and compost and topsoil and things like that for a couple of years. And there are warnings for that on the pesticide label for those herbicides, but we can't really ask the homeowner about that. So we just know that this is kind of an ongoing issue that we're looking out for and trying to help get the word out to gardeners that this could be an issue with manure, compost, and new topsoil that you've installed in your greenhouse or raised beds. So be on the lookout for this one. All right. So I also want to talk a little bit. That was kind of the herbicide side of things. But like I said at the beginning, we can't always blame herbicides for everything, even if we might want to be like, I think my neighbor might have done this to me. We have insects and diseases as well as other abiotic issues in the environment that can cause symptoms that kind of look the same as what we saw today. So let's see what we can figure out from this part. So ruling out pests and abiotic problems is a really important part of our process. So we don't just start blaming herbicide applicators for everything, right? Usually we do this part first in our lab before going down the herbicide path. Sometimes there's a really easy pest explanation or weather. And I would also like to give you a caveat here, which is that I'm a weed scientist, okay? So there's some things out there that we can all look for, like some patterns and clues and stuff that I'll tell you about, but I 100% rely on my colleagues at MSU for help looking at insect and disease problems. If you ask me a lot of specific questions about that, I might not have the answer, but you can still give it a go. I'll be like, call your extension agent, but you know. All right. So we talked a lot about distortion today with herbicides, but there's a lot of distortion that can happen from insect and arthropod damage as well. Okay, we see this a lot. I'm sure you do too in your yard. Well, not this one specifically, but this issue in general. So here's a green ash tree, and it's showing symptoms, including a lot of distortion and epinasty kind of there in the middle of the group of leaves. And this is actually, you know, the ash plant bug causing this issue. This is not an herbicide issue. It's an insect issue. Here is a peony that kind of looks like it might be showing some weird herbicide problems. It's got some distortion going on. You know, is that cupping? Is that curling? It looks weird. It's aryophyid mites. Okay, I'll tell you more about that one in a second. And then here's one. I can't remember what plant this is. But in any case, it is showing some downward curling in the leaves from aphids. Okay, so we've got 3 examples of distortion from insects and arthropods here. So how can we tell the difference? Okay, if we're out in our yard, or you know, maybe we don't have an entomologist handy. My entomology colleague tells me that insects often leave evidence behind. Okay, so they're not too sneaky all the time. A lot of times the insect is still there, or it pooped and you can see its poop left behind. It's frass, sorry. Maybe there will be some chewing damage as well. That honeydew, that sticky waste product from like aphids and scale insects and stuff like that might be present, or maybe you'll see some shed skins. Okay, so they're not super sneaky all the time. So here's some thrips damage here on this leaf. That's a little insect. So that's one clue. But sometimes you really need a microscope and an entomologist. Like this peony here, boy, me and my entomology colleague really went back and forth on this one, both trying to get the other one to say it was their sample. But this is the peony showing symptoms of aryophyid mites, and those little crinkly, curly edges. Actually, once she dissected them, she was able to find aryophyid mites in that. It was almost like they were making a little gall out of it or something. So that one actually took us a little while to figure out. So sometimes it's not super cut and dry, and you need to get some backup. All right, so distortion can also come from plant pathogens. Here is I believe this is a hackberry tree. It's showing symptoms of, you know, that witch's broom kind of growth, right? This is not a normal amount of sprouting from one area of the tree. It's showing symptoms of, you know, yellowing, things like that. That looks a little bit like our glyphosate injury that we looked at earlier today. This is hackberry witch's broom. So this is a disease issue. Okay, this is not glyphosate injury in this case. Here is a tomato plant that's showing a lot of super weird distortion. Maybe you might be like, did I apply some herbicide around here somewhere? This is an example of a tomato plant with a mosaic virus. Okay, so those are a couple of examples. So real talk, a lot of times with this disease stuff, I really need to ask my pathologist friends for help. Because some of this stuff they can test for, and we can really rule it out. Site history is important. If you're not getting to the bottom of it through the disease avenue, was an herbicide even applied? That is really important to keep in mind. And the pattern in the landscape is important. So this tomato here, for example, if there was like 1 or 2 tomatoes showing these symptoms, maybe I would, instead of like 20 in the same garden bed, maybe you'd think, is this a disease issue? But if it was all the tomatoes, maybe you'd think, maybe it's an issue in the soil with an herbicide or something like that. So just kind of puzzling through that kind of stuff is a big part of our process in the lab. All right. And then finally, there's some non-living factors in the environment like weather and nutrient deficiency and things like that can also cause symptoms that might look a little bit like herbicide injury. Here's a squash plant showing some upward cupping symptoms that are from cold damage. And here are some soybean plants, I believe, and they're growing out in the field and they're showing symptoms of yellow chlorosis at the top of the plant. And this is iron deficiency. Okay. So those might make you think herbicide at first, but they both have a different explanation. And to get to the bottom of this, a lot of times site history, again, is key. Was there a frost recently? That can cause a lot of different kinds of distortion in plants that aren't, if it's late in the year or something like that, you can see some really weird distortion on trees and things. And then for our soybean plant down here, you might need to do further testing, because for this one, it might be the whole field, which you might think, was there like an herbicide mishap of some kind? But this was, you may remember the iron deficiency. Maybe to tease this out, we need to do a soil or tissue test for nutrient analysis for this field before we jump to a conclusion of herbicide injury. All right. So there's some resources for you out there if you've got herbicide symptom questions. In Montana, we can ask our local extension office a lot of these questions. I'm sure it's the same in some of our other states as well. They can be a great resource for education about this kind of stuff. State diagnostic labs can help. And this, I'm sure in other states as well as Montana, this is like a visual assessment and education kind of a service. In Montana, if we need something a little bit beyond education and visual assessment, if somebody wants to complain or not complain, but if somebody has like property that's damaged from an herbicide use issue or something like that, we can send them to our Montana Department of Agriculture field offices. And they have staff there that can help investigate this type of issue. So if you need kind of the extra step beyond education, that's where I send people. And then there's also labs available that do test for herbicide residue in plant tissue and soil if that is needed. A lot of times this service costs money, but if you need to go the extra step beyond visual assessment education, this can be a good place to go, this type of a lab. Okay. So today, this hour over lunch, we learned about herbicides. We talked about herbicides a little bit today. We learned about a few causes of non-target herbicide injury to plants in the urban environment. And we learned about some examples of look-like plant health issues and maybe a couple ways that we could tease out what might be going on, whether it's a herbicide or something else. All right, so that is all I've got today. This is a little outdated. We've had a lot of staffing changes at the Schutter Lab, but there we are last summer. It takes a whole team to figure this stuff out sometimes. So, but yeah, thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.